My Govanen, welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this video is something that I've been planning to do for a long time, and there were times where I was considering different ways of doing it, but at this point I'm kind of forced to do it, and that's basically because, to put it bluntly, I'm not really going to be continuing regular posting on this channel for much longer. I may continue posting sporadically, but for various reasons, I'm not really going to be able to continue weekly uploads. One of those reasons is, having done this for 9 years, I am not able to come up with topics that I am interested in quite as easily. In fact, for the past few months, I've had a really hard time and sometimes was desperately scrambling to come up with a topic, by the time it came time to record and edit. So that's part of the reason. And I think that is in part because of the second reason, which is when I started this channel, it was mainly because I had a desire to talk about Tolkien and nobody to do it with. My wife is just not that big of a Tolkien fan, and therefore, talking with her about it was it kind of like talking to a wall. Not exactly like talking to a wall, but it was not the kind of engagement that you want when you're trying to share your passion. And so when I started this channel, it was very much I just want to talk about anything Tolkien. As the years went by, that morphed into I'm really only interested in talking about really deep ideas and things like that. And anybody who's been on my channel long enough knows that this channel has really changed in the kind of content that I put out. And so it's increasingly difficult to think of really deep topics because I've been doing it for so long. Also, because I think at the end of the day, this has become more and more like a work thing and less of a passion thing. As my kids have grown up, and especially my oldest, it's become easier to actually engage with other people about Tolkien related stuff. And so that drive and need is no longer there in the way that it used to be, but also because it's more and more of a chore and less of a thing that I just really want to do. It's not the thing that's on my mind all the time. It's not something that I'm obsessing over in the way that I was. So for all these reasons and others that I won't get into, it's just gotten to a point where I can't continue on a regular basis because there's just not enough there to keep going on a weekly schedule. So I'm going to be doing a 3-part series with this video and do about 3 more probably of the meme videos. And in fact, the whole idea behind the meme videos was to make sure that I had plenty of content to get me through, to make sure that I had enough to kind of get through what I'm trying to do now. And once I get through those, unless I just have another burning topic, that may be the last time that I post weekly on this channel. And at the point that I stop posting weekly, I'm going to basically turn off Patreon and all that stuff. And just, I may post every now and then when I have a burning idea, but that'll probably be the last time that it's just a regular upload. So just wanted to let everybody know that in advance. But the topic of this video and the next 2 that are going to be in this series is what Tolkien talked about. I believe it was in one of his letters. And Tolkien said a lot of things about what the Lord of the Rings was all about and, the themes of it. But in one particular place, he mentions that it's about fall, mortality, and machine. And I think he may have been thinking of his legendarium more broadly when he said that, not just the Lord of the Rings, but I can't remember for sure. And this idea has been in my mind to do videos on for a long time, like I said. And now that I'm reaching kind of the end of my creative juices, it's like, well, I better do this now or I'm not going to do it. So there's these 3 ideas that Tolkien says are really key to the Middle-earth legendarium: fall, mortality, and machine. And of course, by machine, he means things like the ring and, industrialization and the kind of things that he particularly didn't like, bad magic, you might say. And these 3 things may seem kind of unrelated and may not be obvious on the page, But I think if you explore the ideas enough, you can see that they are pretty prevalent in most of his Middle Earth writings, and they tie together fairly neatly. So in this video, I'm going to start with the idea of fall. So, of course, when Tolkien says fall, he's thinking of fall in the sort of Christian or Jewish sense of there is a good thing which falls into ruin or evil or disrepair or whatever it is. And in the biblical case, of course, that is because man sins, and as a result, the rest of creation falls with him. In Tolkien, there are a lot of different types of falls, and Tolkien refers to a few of the events that occur specifically in this way, and there are others that you could even see in that light that aren't specifically called that by him, but that nevertheless are interesting to consider in this regard. So, of course, the first fall that we have to consider is the original, which is basically Melkor's fall from being one of the Ainur, one of the Holy Ones, to being the enemy of Eru Ilúvatar, mostly through his own pride and desire to, just do what he wants to do, and his impatience at, the fact that the void is empty and he's waiting for Ilúvatar to do something about it, and he's getting this idea that, well, maybe I could just do it by myself. And so when Ilúvatar, delivers the themes of the great music to the Ainur and says, okay, sing to this theme, all of a sudden he's got it in his head that, well, I'm just going to do my own thing. And this is a theme that's going to repeat multiple times throughout the falls that are in his legendarium. They're often because of pride or unwillingness to, get along with others. It's just the way it is. But Melkor's original fall, of course, is, the most independent, because his is kind of what sets off everything else. Everybody else's fall is in some way, directly or indirectly, due to his fall at the beginning, because his has the extremely wide-ranging consequence, similar to Adam and Eve's fall in the Bible, of making everything after it worse, and therefore everything is harder, and people are now, people as a whole are now fallen. Tolkien, the way he works this into his Middle-earth mythology, of course, is that because of Melkor's fall and his, discord in the music, it makes it so that the world that is already kind of a broken thing when it is made. As a result, and Tolkien calls this whole concept Arda Marred, Arda being the world, and it's marred because of Melkor's discord. Because of Arda Marred, there are other things that happen that create problems. One of those problems is, for example, the idea that death is in the world from the beginning, and or at least the potential for death. And we see the most significant case probably of this in Finwë and Miriel, because when Miriel gives birth to Feanor, she no longer wishes to be alive, and the Valar are all concerned, like, is this like a thing that we've brought in from, the rest of Arda, which is not really supposed to happen in Valinor, where everything is supposed to be kind of the way it was meant to be originally, but now we've brought basically death into our own realm, and this is a big thing for the Valar. But the fact that Miriel dies also sets off another chain of events, because Feanor grows up without a mother, and he's got this huge chip on his shoulder as a result, and you could see the dominoes falling. And of course, that leads to Feanor's fall, because he makes the Silmarils. He becomes really obsessive, possessive, and proud about them. And because he grows up without a mother and has that huge chip on his shoulder, he's got, all these issues that make him even less willing to, get along with most anybody. And that leads to the fall of Feanor in refusing to, use the Silmarils that remain, that he thinks remain at the time, to restore the trees when they are destroyed. And also, once he finds out that the Silmarils have been stolen by Melkor and that his father is dead, it leads to the fall of the Noldor. And this is one of the areas where Tolkien specifically calls something a fall, because he says that elves don't have a fall in the same sense that humans do, but they do fall in the sense that they rebel and leave Valinor against the advice, but not necessarily command of the Valar. So the Noldor fall by disobeying the Valar, and in the process engaging in the first kinslaying at Alqualande, which is, again, sets off another huge chain of events, because then you get the Doom of Mondos as a result, basically saying, because you did this, you're all going to go die in Middle-earth, and there's not much you can do about it. And so you could see the chains of events, getting set up here, and then the Silmarillion is mostly just these chains of events playing out in Middle-earth as the Noldor try to recover the Silmarils and fight with Morgoth and have all their problems. Now, of course, men also have a fall, and Tolkien really delves into this primarily in the Athrobeth, Finrod Andreth, and the related story of, I forget the name of it, but it's Andreth refers to, human legends of their own fall, and there's a separate writing that deals with that to a degree. But this idea that, while they're out there with no contact with elves, no contact with the Valar, Melkor comes along and basically pretends to be either God or an emissary of God, and gets them to do all kinds of things that they kind of know in their hearts are wrong. But then when they won't do them, he says, well, I'm going to take away all these nice things I've given you. And so a lot of them go along, and next thing you know, they're doing really wicked and evil things. And thus the human race falls too, in a different way than the elves, but somewhat more analogously to the way it happens in the Bible, because in the Bible you only got two of them, Adam and Eve, but they are basically fooled by the devil in the garden to eat the fruit, and then, off it goes from there. So this is why humans are mortal, at least in the opinion of Andreth and others within the human community. And when Finrod hears this, of course, he's like, wait, you think you were originally immortal like we are? That's kind of crazy, because Morgoth shouldn't be powerful enough to change your own fate. And so they have this big conversation about that. And if you haven't read the Athrobeth, you really need to. I've got a video on it. But so you've got the fall of Melkor, the fall of the Noldor, the fall of Feanor specifically. You've got the fall of humanity. You've got these kind of like big major falls that set up everything else that comes after that. And then there are other cases that you could look at that are basically kind of individual falls. And we see this more specifically in the later ages of Middle-earth. We don't see it quite so much in the Silmarillion. Like I said, Feanor kind of has his own personal fall. But it's not really the case that most characters in the Silmarillion go through something that is really kind of analogous to something like a fall. You could argue, for instance, that Thingol kind of does, because he mostly starts out wise and good, but then when he gets the Silmaril, he kind of lets it go to his head, and that fall results in his death rather rapidly. But mostly what we're going to see is stuff in the Lord of the Rings where this sort of thing happens. So you've got probably the most obvious case being Boromir. Boromir is, by and large, a good character with flaws that come from being raised, A, in Gondor, which is in constant war, B, being the son of Denethor, which probably doesn't help much, because Denethor's, got his own not so healthy ideas of whatever. But Boromir in the story has very much a fall, in the sense that he succumbs to the temptation of the ring. Now he almost immediately, redeems himself from that fall. And this is kind of a microcosm of the whole thing, because going back to those original falls in the Silmarillion, which kind of set up everything else, and I've done a video on this before too, everything that gets set up by falls is usually things decline over time, and then eventually it gets so bad that you have an actual disaster, and then there's some kind of recovery, a renewal, something good comes out of it that sets it up again in a better position, which then again declines and eventually, reaches another disaster. And again, this matches the idea of, the biblical framework, or the Judeo-Christian framework of, you had what was good, which became bad, and then it goes downhill, and eventually God, or Eru Ilúvatar, is going to take that thing and remake it into the perfect thing that it was meant to be. And so Boromir is kind of a very tight encapsulation of that, because Boromir is mostly good but with flaws, and because of his flaws he ends up succumbing to the temptation of the ring, and when he does that he realizes his mistake afterwards and then does redeem himself through basically dying to protect Merry and Pippin, or at least attempting to protect them. And Gandalf talks about this, that he was saved in the end, and he basically treats Boromir's sacrifice as a thing that really actually elevates him out of what he was. Now, you also get, I kind of skipped over the second age a little bit, but I really shouldn't have, because, talking about the video where I talked about this kind of as a theme, this happens in the first, second, and third ages. In the first age, what happens is you have the falls, all these various falls that then lead to the War of Morgoth, which completely ends in disaster, but eventually the Valar come in and fix everything, cast Morgoth out, and then everything's kind of not perfect, obviously, but much better off. In the second age, the story really is about Numenor. Numenor starts off as almost a paradise, and then, of course, it becomes corrupted and eventually is destroyed in a disaster because of its own fall into the desire to break the ban of the Valar, try to attain immortality, even though they can't really. It ends in the same process. And then you set it up again for the third age. Gondor and Arnor also, dwindle over time. Arnor ends up being, ultimately destroyed, basically. But then you end again with Aragorn at the end of the third age renewing the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. So the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor don't really fall in the same way that Numenor do. They just kind of get worn down. But you get that same kind of process over and over. And, you can see the fall as either applying to a whole race like elves and humans, or you can see it applying to specific, peoples or nations like Numenor, and you could see it in individuals, like we mentioned Boromir. Denethor also has his own fall. Denethor is hardly what I would call, an ideal character to base your life around, but he has a lot of good qualities that mostly get overlooked in the movies, but at least in, the book, we can recognize that he is shrewd, he is wise in his own way, he is, steadfast for the most part, but he eventually does succumb to despair, partially because of the deaths of his sons, or at least what he perceives to be the deaths of both of his sons, but also because Sauron is manipulating him into thinking there's no possible way you can succeed. And, I kind of like Corey Olsen's theory that whenever he's up using the Palantir, what he sees, at least in part, is Frodo captured in Mordor. And that's what really pushes him over the edge, because he's basically been told, I've got the ring, which Sauron doesn't. But nevertheless, he thinks that because of what he knows from Gandalf and Faramir is that Frodo has the ring and now he's been captured, so therefore, well, it's all over. So Denethor, his fall is kind of one of, because he tries to rely too much on his own wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, he very much just falls because he has no Estel, no hope. And so when his Amdir is taken away, the only support he had is just gone now. We also have other characters who have falls, of course, that are less obvious. Frodo has a fall because Frodo falls to the temptation of the ring at Mount Doom. Now, Tolkien will admit that this fall was kind of inevitable because nobody, Frodo included, could actually resist the power of the ring at the center of Sauron's power. It's just not going to happen. Nevertheless, it is a failing, and Tolkien calls it that. He failed. He had a moral failure, and there you go. Now, the fact that it was beyond his capacity, takes away the culpability of it, and he doesn't really, redeem himself, because that's not really, you can't redeem yourself from something that you had no control over, really, but it is nevertheless a type of fall. And it's, it speaks, I think, to the inevitability in the Christian mind of the fact that all humans, as fallen creatures, are going to fall into some sin or other. So this speaks, broadly to the Christian themes that Tolkien said were present in his stories. You could also look at other characters for this, because you've got Gollum, who falls early and quickly. We don't really need to dwell on that too much. It's kind of obvious. Saruman is a good example of a character who falls because Saruman was the head of the White Council. He was the head of the Order of Wizards. He was supposed to be the chief opponent of Sauron in Middle-earth during the last part of the Third Age, and yet because of his own pride and everything else, much like Feanor, he thinks, well, I can do, what I want, and then he also kind of succumbs to despair in a sense because he comes to believe that there's no winning and therefore it's better to just join Sauron and try to maybe finagle his way to the top, by cunning later on, which is, I think that's a really good example of the idea that we can use our own human wisdom, and it sometimes works, but often it has its limits, and it's better to pay attention to God than our own intelligence, because when you go about doing things what you think is the best way, very often it ends up being kind of backwards. And again, going to that that whole Christian influence idea, I forget exactly where the verse is, but there is a verse that talks about the wisdom of the foolishness of God being wiser than the wisdom of men. So we can think we're doing something that's really smart, and all the while God is looking at that going, man, they're a bunch of idiots. So the idea that we could use our own wisdom to succeed in these endeavors instead of using, the wisdom God has given us, again, I think that is very much informing Tolkien's writing of a character like Saruman. It's also very similar to Turin's story, because Turin's whole story is basically him thinking, I'm just going to do it my way, and I'm just going to be an awesome warrior, and I'm just going to do what I want, and everything he does goes wrong. But he doesn't really fall in the same way because he's kind of never, in a position to fall from. He's always just kind of like, he starts at ground level and just digs deeper all the time. You've also got, beyond those characters, you could even argue that, Theoden has a fall because he kind of listens to Wormtongue too much and lets himself sink into despair. And then, of course, Gandalf rescues him from that. You've got, even Sauron, of course, has a fall because, as Elrond says at the Council of Elrond, nothing is evil in the beginning. Sauron was tempted by the power and, apparent efficacy of Morgoth, thinking, well, he's got all this power and he can kind of do what he wants. That seems like a much more efficient way of attaining the goals that I want to attain than, hanging around with, these bozos in Valinor. So he falls, but then he has kind of a second fall because after the first stage, he's semi-repentant, maybe repentant, hesitantly repentant. It's not 100% clear, but over time, he again falls into his evil ways and then eventually reaches the point where he's just like, nope, I'm just going to be the Dark Lord and, repeat the whole Morgoth thing. And he eventually, in his pride and desire to control everything, makes the ring, which ends up being his own downfall, of course. So there's also the theme of your fall is your own destruction, ultimately, because, Melkor's fall leads to his own being cast out of Arda, and eventually, depending on which version of, the end you read, Turin may kill him with his black sword or, whatever, but he's not gonna turn out well at the end. Neither is Sauron. Sauron is basically nothing by the end of the Lord of the Rings, and to the extent that he survives at all, he is not going to be happy with the result, when the second music occurs. So you've got all these different characters who have their various types of falls. Now, the reason all this is important is not just because it mirrors Tolkien's Christian beliefs, but it also plays into kind of the next topic, which is mortality. Of course, for humans, this is kind of obvious. Humans become mortal, at least by their own legends, because of their fall. And we're going to explore that in the next video. Elves have always been mortal in the sense that they can be killed, and that becomes just a much bigger problem after they leave Valinor for obvious reasons. But the mortality issue will then lead into the problem of the machine, because the machine is in some sense the fallen response to the mortality problem. How can we ourselves fix the problem that we created? And this is again going to go back to that idea of God will fix the things. You don't try to fix them with your own wisdom because you're going to screw it up. So in the next two videos that I do, that's going to be kind of the through line that carries through the whole thing is how does mortality set up how does the fall set up the problem of mortality, and how does that lead to the additional problematic response of the machine? Which that's not to say that all aspects of mortality and machine are going to tie back, but it is a part of it. So look forward to those next two videos. That'll be interesting, but this will kind of wrap it up for the fall. I think I've covered enough of it to give enough of a groundwork. I'm going to be interspersing these also with the memes videos. I'll have 2 or 3 or more of those, as I said, and they'll kind of be interspersed with these. But I'm going to try to end with the, my last regular video, unless, again, I come up with more topics, is going to be the one where I talk about the machine. So that's kind of the plan for the next few weeks. And then after that, if I have a burning idea, I'll put one out there. But at the moment, I don't have any. So at any rate, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it was an interesting look at this theme that Tolkien himself said was a prevalent thing in his own work. If you did find it useful, educational, edifying, whatever, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. Make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're watching on. And if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Not that there's going to be a ton of those coming in the future, but still. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter, where I am still planning to continue doing Tolkien-related trivia questions every week for a while at least. And, of course, check out the description for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.